Hi everyone, welcome to our rendering teardown section. My name is Simon. Today we're going to have a look at this interior rendering of a bachelor flat or a couple flat. I don't know. Anyway, in terms of composition, which is always the first thing you have to look at in an image, there's a couple of things. Like the image itself could be interesting. It's definitely not that bad. It's just that one thing that is striking me is first the focal length, which is not really convincing, because if we imagine the floor plan of our little flat here, you can see we have your entrance here and sort of partition here with a bed somewhere here, and we're sort of around here, and you can see that we can get this part as well as this part here, which is quite a huge field of view, and it's, well, above being huge, it's actually unrealistic in terms of like if you compare it with the human eye, which is something you have to keep in mind. Basically, if you want your image to look realistic, it first has to look like something you could actually see with your eyes. So here we have like a FOV that is not really human relatable, so I wouldn't use that. Although I completely understand that the idea is to get as much as you can of the space, but this is something with your client that you have to be aware of. You will never get everything in a single image, so you have to be careful with your client regarding what they actually want to show and like the hierarchy of what is interesting in the project, and just know that you can only show maybe one or two main ideas, or actually you can actually show just one, and the other things are just going to be slight details in the image, but you cannot make your image about every single topic, because otherwise it won't be really legible. So beside that, like the other thing I think could be interesting, although it's just a point of view, but I quite like when I'm dealing with interior renderings to get a grasp of what's happening outside. Here it's still quite working here because we have a nice, well, we'll talk about it later, but the lighting is coming, like we can sense that the light comes from here, and we have cast shadows that are quite interesting. Still, it always a little bit more, like it could be potentially interesting if we did like sort of the opposite of this view. Instead of being here looking that way, so we have that, we would be sort of here looking this way. That way, the difference would be quite interesting, because we could get a view to the outside, which is something quite interesting, because part of what is interesting in an apartment is actually what you can see from your balcony or from your window. Second thing is that the reflection of your windows here will give you information of what's happening here. So it could be a good trade-off between actually looking that way and having no information of what's happening here, or being here and looking that way and having actually all the information. You could even get from the reflection in this window some information of what's happening here, even though it's already quite interesting. So that's it for the composition. It's still like a pretty, well, it doesn't feel too, it feels a bit odd, but still it's not that bad. Regarding the lighting, here I'm a little bit more disturbed, because as you can see, if we put it in black and white, there's no, like, everything, it lacks a bit of contrast, and everything seems to be lit, which is not really what you want to have, because it's quite complicated to create a hierarchy in your image if all your if everything is in the sunlight or in artificial light. And here the problem is that we have everything. We have natural lighting coming from here that gives this interesting cast shadows, but since we also have some sort of soft boxes like here and there, they get like the contrast is less interesting because and you can barely read it, and every white area is a little bit burned. Here it could be interesting to have this sort of like to get the legibility of this idea of having like a light well here. So what I would suggest is actually simplifying the whole thing, because I don't know, it might not work actually because everything is a little bit too bright. But if we start doing this, so by simplifying the lighting, the idea would be to get these cast shadow here a little bit better so that you understand better where the sun comes from, and just have a softbox here bringing you light behind your books here. So really simple, and you wouldn't actually need much more. You might need like one softbox behind this to get like interesting light here, but I think you could actually get it already from the outside so that you get a cast shadow of your bed here. That would be here. So try to simplify everything. Maybe it was actually like that at the very beginning, but the whole image has been overexposed. Whatever happened, that's still what I would suggest regarding the lighting. In terms of modeling, there are many small details that I quite enjoy seeing in renderings. Basically the plinth here, the little electrical socket, kind of small details of stuff happening here, like a sort of quite convincing kitchen and everything like that, and kind of decoration above it. But one thing though, like you can see here with the deformation due to the focal length, is that this kind of objects here look extremely huge compared to your door here, which is not really what you want. Same happens with your shoes here, since they're near the outs and near the edge of your image, they get a little bit deformed, which is not really a good thing. Regarding, well, but basically what the final and basic, here you can see there are nice small details. The basic thing though is to always be careful to get to avoid sharp edges on your model. It's really simple to change it, so it would be a shame not to do it, and it will create something really interesting, because the difference between an edge and like a sharp edge and a slightly chamfered one is that here you're gonna have like a black. If your light comes this way, this is gonna be in the shadow, this is gonna be in the light, and that's it. Whereas if you do it here, this is gonna be in the shadow, this is gonna be in the light. You're gonna have a really smooth transition here, which is gonna be quite interesting. And if you pay attention to basically the real world, you're gonna see that there's always like a tiny chamfer everywhere, because we were not really able at the moment to do perfectly sharp angles, especially with concrete and mortar and stuff like that. So that's it. And another thing would be more regarding texturing. One small detail first is regarding the books here. There are two things I'd like to say about it. First one is, it would be interesting to have a tiny bit more variation. If you actually bought the model plus model pack, or whatever you call it, you have their script that sort of lets you place them in a more random way, because here you can see you only have them vertical or horizontal, but you know that it could be interesting to also have them slightly tilted or stuff like that. So it would be interesting to have tiny bit more variation in your library. And the other thing is try to, as soon as you can or get the time to, just scan whatever cover you have of your own books, so that you can get something a little bit more bespoke, because these models are extremely famous, and even though they're good, but it's just that it becomes kind of eye-catching to always see the same books in every rendering. And it's so you can definitely use the same model because they're good, but if you get the time to do it, just scan some covers of your own books so that you get something a little bit more personal. The other thing regarding texturing will be with the wood here. There's a couple of problems with the wood, which I'm going to talk about because it definitely looks like one of the main piece in the project, or in the image at least. The problem is, as you can see, that the UV, like the texture, sort of spans from one cabinetry to the other sort of seamlessly, which is not really how it would behave in real life, because you're never sure that like say you have a plank, you never know that if you're gonna cut it, it's actually gonna be like they're actually gonna be next to each other in real life. More realistically, you're gonna have quite a bit of discrepancy between adjacent doors. So what you want to do is to actually use, like, it depends on what software you're using, but if you're using say 3ds Max, you're gonna have like basically a material by element modifier, and this way you can add a different texture to each door here, which basically is going to make them a little bit different, and so that they won't, like the UVW won't be perfectly continuous. What you can do if you only have one texture is to actually have a UV, like a single UV mapping pair door. The other thing you want to have a look at here, well, there's a tiny problem with the UV mapping here. You can see it sort of stops before the actual edge, but that's okay. The other thing you can do, and that is quite weird actually, because you can see here that the reflection is quite intense, whereas on the rest of the cabinetry here, everything looks extremely dull or not reflective at all. So I would actually suggest trying to play around with the reflection so that you get something a little bit more reflective in the end, but play around with the glossiness as well. What you can do, in the same way that you have one texture per door here, is to get a single like a dirt map texture or whatever, and get a different one for each door, so that the reflection is slightly different from one door to another, because even though you can get like a single finish on your kitchen, you'll always have slight discrepancies between doors. So it's always interesting to sort of recreate these discrepancies. But beside that, this is an actually good rendering to, well, there are a couple of things to change, but it's a good start. What I'm going to try to do is to take a couple of minutes to tweak it so that it sort of fits what I have in mind, and I'll get back to it with a couple of comments as to all the slight changes I've made. So I think I'll just let the let the record go and just do it right now. So. Okay, so if we have a look at a couple of adjustments I just did, it's going to be really quick since it's mostly about lighting. So first thing I did was changing the levels. Well, it gets a little bit burnt because the contrast was really, there was really low contrast, but as you can see, the idea here is to bring back a bit of detail in this area here, and whoops, sorry, on the cabinetry here, and also with a burn and dodge tool, try to rebalance the, bring a little bit of light from the outside. So there's a couple of God rays here, which are really, as you can see, they're extremely subtle, but they could be interesting, in my opinion. And also try to sort of rebalance the image. Basically, as you can see here, if we switch on and off, basically the light switch from being around here to being around here, like the light source, which is sort of what we wanted to achieve, because it looks a little bit more realistic to have the light coming from the window rather than from some invisible softboxes. So that's the idea. Of course, you can see the contrast on the cabinetry is way too high, but it's just I cannot really, I could rechange it, but it's not really the point here. The other thing is a tiny bit of warmth here, and especially the problem is when you change the levels is that you get your saturation up. So here the saturation were lowered a little bit, maybe a bit too much actually, but that's the thing. I think it's pretty much it. The thing is, basically, the idea regarding the lighting here is to rely more on this sort of really interesting cast shadows that you have here, rather than some weird too direct lighting you could have, or softboxes you could have everywhere, because it's then sort of fills the whole place with homogeneous light, which is not something you actually want, because then you cannot really create interesting atmosphere, because everything is at the same value. Here, for example, it could be the fact that you have exactly the same value here is a kind of a problem. It would be interesting to have this placed, this wall here, a tiny bit darker, just so that this one stands out a little bit more and things like that. But it's really simple, just adjusting lighting, tweaking composition, and having a look at basically the main thing you have to do when you're doing renderings is to really have a really specific and legible hierarchy of what are the most important part of your image, so that first you can compose your image according to that hierarchy, so that you sort of focus on interesting aspects in the image. And the second thing is that each all the most important part of your image hierarchy wise have to have really really efficient and realistic material. So here in our case, as I was saying, this kitchen is taking quite a big part, like this whole wall here is a huge part of the image, so you have to be extra careful as to how you map your textures on it and how your material is behaving and how reflection works and all that stuff. And you also have to be sort of thinking on how light can actually emphasize and make it look good, because in our case here, this really bright area here with the light coming from here are not the best idea. I think it would be way more interesting, I think, to have your sort of low sun coming here and having some interesting cast shadows and a much warmer feeling, the same way you get here, but have it a little bit higher, something like that. Either way, as you can see, the difference is quite interesting, and it's really just a part of actually I could where is it, that I could sort of lower my dodge here, because as I said, it doesn't need to be this bright, like that. Yeah. I'll stop right there. Hopefully you've learned some interesting tips here and there, and you sort of get the idea of how you have to think about your composition and how light can really affect your image overall, and basically really have like a interesting, like a really thorough checklist before actually starting to do anything, because in the same way that you have to think before you take a photograph, you basically have to think before you hit the render button, so that you get the most out of your space, especially in our case where the modeling is actually quite convincing. So there's definitely potential to make to take this image to the next level. So yeah, thank you, and I'll see you in the next teardown. Thanks guys, bye.
Tonight, John, and